Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to Bread with the Sisters. Today we have a very special guest, Leo Severino.
Why am I so special?
Because you're our honored guest.
Oh, thank you.
We're honored to have you. You're very insightful. You have a lot of knowledge and wisdom to impart, and
Thank you for
we
that.
think people can truly take from it.
I hope so.
I'll give them a little bit of background about you. Leo here is a former lawyer of Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. It is one of the world's largest law firms. He has a deep passion for theology and philosophy, which is why he's on the show today. He is currently a film producer and a writer. So if you want to check out his IMDb, feel free. So we have Leo on the show today because one of his books, Going Deeper, is the premise for our topic, which is truth. And I guess we want to start off with that. What is truth and why is truth important?
Oh, so you start with the easy question.
So we're starting with it?
Yes. There's no dipping the big toe with this one, is there? It's just straight in.
Yeah.
What is truth? And what was the second part of the question?
And why is it important?
Why is it important? Well, theologically speaking, there's three aspects of truth. The one that I think is one that we were most in contact with on a daily basis is the way our thoughts adequate with reality. So if if the image we have in our head equates to the corresponding reality outside of our head, then we've arrived at truth. So it's a very common definition, and it's very common to our experience because every single moment of our conscious thought, we're actually basing how we behave on some truth. Mm-hmm. And so that answers the question why it's important. So to give an example, if in my head I'm running across a mountain path and I don't believe that there's a massive cliff 20 feet ahead of me, and there happens to be one, well then my thoughts aren't matching reality and I haven't arrived at the truth. And whether that image is in my head adequately to what is in reality or not is going to depend upon whether I stop, whether I keep running, whether I fall to my hurt or death. And so it makes an enormous amount of difference.
Okay. And how do you put this even, moral terms, as far as how do people approach this in their day-to-day life?
Well, it's the same thing. There's no difference from a moral perspective as to what truth is. So I don't think there's a truth that's the truth that speaks to morality and the truth that doesn't. The definition that I believe is best and has been accepted for basically all time has to do with reality itself. What is reality and how do our thoughts equate to that reality? So like I said, depending on the object, it could be something very innocuous. Whether I believe this chair is strong enough to hold my weight, which both of us believe that to be the case, that to be the truth because we both sat in it. Mm-hmm. Or whether we believe that a little vial, a glass vial with a perforated metal cap and white powder in it has salt in it when we pour it on our French fries. On its face, it's not a moral question, but there's all kinds of white powdery substances, all of which would have radically different effects if we poured them on our French fries. So underneath the reality of what our thoughts are, there is the possibility of a moral content depending on the object.
But why should people care? Why is it important?
Well, it's the question, why should people care, is one that we should probably reject summarily. People do care. There's no such thing as not caring. From the most someone who believes that there is no truth or that life is meaningless, either one of those two extremes is contradicting themselves. They actually believe in truth and they actually believe that life is meaningful. Otherwise they wouldn't speak. Here's what I mean by that. If someone were to say to you, there is no truth, what they're really saying is, it is true that there is no truth. They're making a truth claim. Mm-hmm. The second they make the claim that there is no truth. So they're acting as if there actually is truth, particularly if they're trying to speak to anybody else about it, because they're presuming a common ground in reality that isn't subject to whim or to a subjective state that isn't objective enough for us to have a common conversation. So we have no choice to believe that there is a truth. And anyone who says otherwise is either misguided or they're not seeing the totality of it. Same with those who believe that life is meaningless. If life is meaningless, I'm presuming what they mean by that is that there's no particularly intelligible order to the thing. And if that's the case, that must mean that thought itself is meaningless. It's just a byproduct of a meaningless life. And if that's the case, well then, if thought is meaningless because life is meaningless, then the very thought that life is meaningless is itself meaningless.
Yes, that's what.
And you have no reason to believe it. So truth is a suffocating thing at first when you butt up against it, just as reality is. But it's ultimately liberating, because once we accept essentially what we're talking about here is first principles of logic, then we have a playing ground, then we have a baseline upon which we can converse intelligently. Without that, we don't, so there's no sense in speaking.
And what are the first principles of logic?
Well, there's a whole bunch of them, right? The principle of identity, the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of the excluded middle. You can do an entire semester of philosophy just on the first principles. But I find that they've been, first principles need to be, are by their nature self-evident. So the principle of identity, A is A, that's obvious. But if A is A, it leads to a bunch of other things, like, for example, the principle of the excluded middle, which implies that there is no mean between truth and non-truth. And in ontological terms, there is no middle ground between existence and non-existence. Either a thing is or it is not. And we find that this principle is violated so much nowadays. And the violation of it, back in previous times, would have been considered insanity. That's how we would gauge someone, is whether they're insane or they're not insane, is if they reject first principles. If you can't accept that A is A, then we have no basis upon which to communicate, and you have no real rational thought. Now, I'm not saying people do this intentionally, but it's crept in to these notions like there is no truth, which violates first principles, or that truth is meaningless, which violates first principles.
Okay, so what do you think of this? So I guess it goes back to the same thing. My truth is my truth.
Yeah.
And everything is perspective.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own individual perspective, and that is the only thing that matters.
Well, I think you've confounded two different things, right? My truth is my truth. Depends what you mean by that. And perspective, it's self-evident. Everyone has a different perspective. Right? You can't be even seeing the things that I'm seeing unless you're inside my body in this particular perspective. But when we say my truth is my truth, and I think what you mean by that, or what you're depicting people to mean by that, is that there is no objective truth between you and I. You have your subjective truth and I have my subjective truth. If that were the case, then we would have no basis upon which to communicate, because we couldn't even say that it is true that you have a subjective truth and I have a subjective truth, because that would have to be objectively true. And we'd have no basis upon which to communicate. So again, it falls back to first principles. When people say my truth is my truth, is your truth, I would respond to them, oh, is that true?
Okay.
Is that objectively true? Or is that just your truth? Because if it's just your truth, I have no way of ever piercing that, and we should never be communicating. You should never be uttering the words, my truth is my truth, because you're claiming something to be a greater truth than merely your truth.
Yes.
So again, it's that backdoor way to try to undo the objectivity of truth and reality, which always will fail. Will always fail.
And I think it just shows a denial too. Like, people just they fail to face reality, or they choose not to face reality. So they rather deny it based off of, again, whatever their whims are, because it doesn't fit to their needs or to their feelings at that time. So it's like it doesn't go into, I guess this is where the my truth is my truth, because it doesn't go in accordance to what they want, which is their truth at that moment. Do you know what I mean?
I don't exactly. I think what you're trying to say is that when people say my truth, they're trying to bend reality to their will, or to their whim, or to their perspective.
Yes.
Here's everyone's going to have a different perspective, but what we can't deny is that reality is independent of our perspective. In other words, it exists apart from our perspective so that we can have a perspective. Like I said, if going back to my example of we're running on a mountain trail, if there is a massive cliff ahead of us, your perspective of that cliff and my perspective of that cliff are different perspectives, but they're of the same cliff. And so if what you're trying to say is that a way of denying the reality of whether a cliff exists or not is by saying that there's just my truth, then I would agree. That's a form of insanity. There's no way that your truth, in quotes, is going to deny the reality of whether there's a cliff there or not. If by my truth I mean I have a different perspective of the cliff, then we're in agreement. So I don't know the general psychology of people who claim this, but if they mean to deny objective reality, it's a futile endeavor. It's never going to happen. Even the very words are a reality that exists objectively and apart from them, so that it could be intelligible to anyone else around them, so that we can have a common discourse and communicate and discuss things like whether a particular statement A or B is true.
And, as far as religion, because this is a faith-based channel, and a lot of people deny religion. They said that the only good of religion is the control that it has on people. So, and that is quote. Is there reason and logic in religion and faith?
Well, so two things to be said. The only purpose of religion, would you say the only good of religion is to control people?
It's to control people.
Right. Well, I think that just shows an incredible ignorance as to what tenets of religion claim to be. It's very rare that you come across religions who control by force of arms or by force of a state. I know that historically there's been examples of that, but it isn't the common either stated or real objective. When you say, is religion based in logic and truth, or is faith based in logic and truth? Those are two different questions. So, if religion isn't based in truth and logic, then it should not be believed. Because the only thing that we have in order to gauge whether something should be believed or not believed are truth and logic, are these first principles ultimately that we're talking about. So if a religion is not based or rooted in a truth and that is reasoned, then it should not be believed by anybody. Now the question of faith is a different question. There's all kinds of different definitions of faith throughout. I will use the classical one that's used philosophically, which is a grasping of revealed truth. In other words, the idea is that, I mentioned in the beginning, there's different aspects of truth. One of them is as it is in reality to experience. Well, there's a claim that there's a truth that's even greater than that transcends even the physical reality. And that's the realm of, in many ways, the realm of religion. And if we mean by faith a grasping of the revealed truth, then what that necessarily will result in is a matching up with reality. Because the idea is that there's something beyond our perceived reality that gave us this perceived reality, and that would be the common notion of God. And God creating this reality, if truth is adequation to that reality, could never contradict himself, could never contradict the reality that he caused, because the cause can't contradict the effect. And so if there's a truth that is beyond our sensible grasp, then that truth would also not contradict the reality. It would just be a subsequent reality caused by the same source, in which case faith would not contradict reason, but perhaps go beyond what our sensible perception of reality would be. So it would be faith buttressing understanding and logic and reason. That's the classical version of faith and religion.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And how did you find this for yourself?
Oh, well, it's been decades of studying, really. I think providentially. I was studying in England, and I stumbled upon a book by C.S. Lewis, who, as you might know, is a philosopher and a theologian. And he was at Oxford, and the book challenged me to the core, just because it presented an interesting philosophical discussion or conundrum. Mind you, I'd been studying philosophy and law at the time, and it's a book called The Problem of Pain. And I remember the back cover. The back cover said, if God is all powerful, he can do what he wants. And if he's all loving, he doesn't want anyone to suffer. Yet there is suffering in the world. So either God is not all powerful, or he's not all loving, or he doesn't exist. And I just thought, that's an interesting dilemma. Let's presume this thing as God actually exists. And let's presume that he's all powerful and all loving. Well, if I love someone, I don't want them to suffer. And if I had the power to stop the suffering, why wouldn't I? In which case, there is suffering. And if we believe God... So it just proved to be this interesting philosophical, logical conundrum for me. So I started reading the book. I started at 7 in the evening, and I finished at 7 in the morning, and it just absolutely floored me. I've never sat and read a book like that from cover to cover. And because it really spoke to me, because it spoke in the language of logic and philosophy, which I've been studying, but it spoke about a reality that was even greater. And by the way, he answers the question in such an eloquent and beautiful way. The question is on its face actually has a fault in one of its premises, logically, that gives the perceived conclusion that God is neither all powerful or loving or doesn't exist, when the reality is quite the opposite.
Okay, so how does your personal journey to arriving at the truth correlate with the church?
It's a big question, isn't it?
Yes. And I think and the reason why I ask, I think it's a very important one, because one, not only religion, but people don't find the church valuable anymore. They don't feel the need to go to church. They say, I have my Bible and that's all I need. Why do I need to be surrounded in it,
Yeah, there's layers and layers. There's no way to answer that
I know,
in the short amount of time that we have.
Yes.
But the first thing I would say is I have not arrived at all truth. Obviously,
Yeah.
that's the realm of God. But it was through a logical exploration that I did come back to the faith of my youth, and it was mostly because of that book I told you about, C.S. Lewis. I read it, and in so doing, I realized, boy, there's a whole couple thousand years of historical precedent of very, very brilliant minds, far greater than mine, thinking about these very, very deep thoughts, and yet having faith. So on its face, it seemed obvious to me that the two aren't contradictory. And being inquisitive by nature and curious by nature, I had all these objections, not unlike Lewis, who found himself at the time at Oxford. He said he found himself having these questions that people already seemed to have answered for forever, and so he felt that he was morally somewhat of a trousered ape relative to adults that were already here having these discussions. And I felt the same way. I came late to this discussion, and I thought, how in the world did I not know that there's actually logical, for example, proofs of the existence of God, or of his properties, or of his nature? And in the same way, the notion that which is obviously and patently true, if God exists, he is the cause of all things, including our very existence. And so there is most certainly a personal, if you will, relationship, in as much as God is required to keep me personally in existence, and to even allow me to have the airwaves around me exist in such a way that I can communicate, right? So it's obviously the most intimate of all relationships that there could be. But at the same time, if God is the author of all truth, then there's also a distance there. There's a formality to reality, and there's a structure to it, and it's ordered. And what I found was that there's been brilliant minds in the church, particularly, that have been exploring and explaining that order. The obvious one that comes to mind is St. Thomas Aquinas, who built on the philosophical tradition of the Greeks, particularly Aristotle, who had been questioning reality and transcendent reality for eons. And what I found was that all of my objections, which I thought were ever so clever, had already been answered, and had been answered in such a profoundly erudite way that I remember I said in the beginning that truth is very suffocating, because it's just reality, and if you're fighting against it, you're fighting against yourself, really.
Yeah.
I found that to be the case with the church. Every objection that I had, not only did I find there was a reasonable answer to it, it was an answer that was more profound and more logical than I ever thought possible. So I believe it because I believe it to be true.
And that is the Catholic Church?
I'm Catholic, yes. I'm Catholic. I wasn't. For a while, I was trying to be what C.S. Lewis was, which was he was a high church Anglo-Catholic. And I was in England at the time, so I thought, oh, that's easy enough. I'll just go to that. And but it turns out it doesn't exist anymore. so yes.
And you found all the truths to be in the Catholic Church.
I did.
As
yes.
you were seeking.
All of my objections, kind of all roads eventually pointed to Rome. All the different objections I had in the path that I was exploring were ones that I could only find satisfactory answer in people that were Catholic. So I thought, maybe where there's smoke, there's fire.
So what do you think now, again, in regards to truth, when there's so many churches and they all claim to have the truth, and the Catholic Church is based off of being, of holding that true truth?
Yeah, so
how do people...
Here's what I think is, wherever there is truth, as we said in the beginning, there's God. because God being the cause of all reality and truth being the adequation of our thoughts to that reality. If we find truth anywhere, then we find an element of God. Now, by way of all the different plenitude of religions, obviously if they're making different truth claims about things that are the same object, if we're going to be consistent, and as politically incorrect as it seems, you can't hold two contrary positions about the same object and be consistent when it comes to truth, because that would violate the principles that we talked about, the principles of logic, the principles of non-contradiction, and the excluded middle, etc. And so if there are two objects or two claimants about one truth and they're opposed about it, only one of those can be true. So I think really where ecumenism, I think the role that ecumenism really should take is exploring what is the truth and opposing claims to the same truth, communicating in an open way, logical way, to discern on any particular contention whether it is true or it isn't, and which position holds closest to that truth. And if one holds closer to the truth than another, then that's the one that we should be holding if we're going to be logically consistent.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So I have some statements that I've collected from many people just through conversation. And this is what would you say to this?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'll say no.
Okay, I'll start with the easy one. So what do you say to the statement that there's no inherent bad?
Why is that an easy one?
If
that's the easy one.
If you hear the things that they say, it
depends what you mean by inherent and bad. I don't believe that person would believe that there's no such thing as evil, there's no such thing as bad. I imagine if we took them and took the ones they loved and started torturing them, that they would believe that there is something inherently wrong with that. So it seems to me that it's self-evident. Anyone who claims that there is no inherent bad would, at the very least, claim that it is inherently bad to claim that there is inherent badness, I think.
So everything just does that.
Yeah.
TikTok. Okay. So how would you describe the current culture and how closely does it align with the truth?
Well, it depends what you mean. If we start with our premise that truth is reality, then the current culture is just part of reality, in which case it is part of the truth. If what you mean by that is how is our society as such corresponding to, for example, moral truths, I think there's a lot of deficiencies. Just like even in this grab bag that you're about to put together, even the previous one, there is this notion generally that truth is subjective, that all truth is subjective, that good and bad are subjective, that there's such a thing as my truth, which isn't, which overrides objective reality, those sorts of things. I think in previous generations, they would have presumed those notions to have been a form of insanity. So they would have called a society that believed those as culturally insane. Now, having said that, we are nonetheless blessed to live in a country that still has founding principles, and so I think there's plenty of evidence for hope.
But how strongly are we keeping to these founding principles? Because right now it seems we're all over the place. Okay, morally, politically, it's just it's kind of the nature of a democratic republic. When it's going to be representative government, you're going to get a representation of the entire spectrum of what people believe in a society. So it's kind of the nature of what we built in, which is, by the way, why I don't think it's the most ideal form of government. I know that's politically incorrect. What's the most ideal form of government?
Oh, you don't want to know what I think.
I think we want to know.
You really don't.
This enlightenment, this self-revelation is heavily sought, specifically in psychedelics. I know, and there's this new drug that you can go to Peru to get. I don't know if you heard of it. It's like Oaxaca or something like that. Anyway, you take it, and it's supposed to reveal your true self to you. So, there's ascending we talk about ascension in one way in the church, they talk about ascension the other way. But it opens this doorway, and you see a lot of things that they say in the spiritual realm that you normally don't see. And to them, that is their way of going about finding truth. I've asked multiple people this, different race, different backgrounds, different ages, and they're very much heavily into this. What do you think? What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's so if we believe that there's a spiritual reality beyond the reality that is sensible, then it's not impossible to access that reality one way or another. Now, mind you, I'm not sure there's a lot of evidence for the fact that if you mess with your chemical brain composition, it's actually going to get you more in touch with the reality. Like, why would the physical manipulation result in some spiritual reality? I guess the way to gauge that would be, are you still holding to first principles in this altered state? And my hunch is that you're probably not. And the idea is that if we're messing with our brainwaves, that we're going to be in greater touch with reality. I don't think it's borne out by the sciences at all. And let's presume there is some other reality that is accessible in this way that is almost contrary to our nature. And that probably, getting back to the first question about inherent bad, inherent evil, that's probably things that are contrary to the design of the thing, is the very definition of violence. If you go contrary to so my elbow is meant to bend by its nature this way. If I go contrary to that nature, I'm doing violence to the thing. And we would all probably say that if I did that to my elbow, it would be to the evil of the elbow. And so let's presume that there is inherent bad. And let's presume that there is a spiritual reality that can either be good or evil. And we're using a means that is violent to our nature, which by definition is evil. Then we're probably not accessing the best of the good by doing these things. So I would venture to say it's not a very good idea.
Yeah.
By the way, that's not going to, and if by enlightenment we mean being in touch with reality, there's enough reality to go around in this sensible realm that I think is a good basis for exploration. If we go back to the definition of faith I give, faith would be building upon reason and expanding understanding beyond what its natural capacity could be to a heightened state. I think it's a better way to go.
So my last question would be, as Christians, we're using, how do we take our faith and go through the logical steps that you say of reason and this moral objectiveness in the world, specifically in voting right now? Everything's very politically charged. So how do we make sure that we're aligning ourselves with the right things, that we're looking at the issues and to the best of our ability to what is given, we're choosing what is most close to the good?
Yes, no, that's a very good question. Because it's not readily apparent. By the way, it was one of the reasons why I chose the path of Catholicism, is because there's actually a systematic theology that exists in our tradition that claims to have the answers for these very things. So St. Thomas, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas speaks about the principles for cooperation with evil, which are very important, relative in a pluralistic society that's representative the way that we have. Is there a time when casting your vote for X candidate who believes these amount of things which are very, very good and are obviously good, and these amount of things which are obviously evil, are you allowed to, are you not allowed, is it morally acceptable to vote for such candidate? Well, there's actually principles that we can know and discern that I believe to be very, very accurate, which give us a standard upon which to gauge these things. So, for example, just in that one, cooperation with evil, which isn't the overall measure of everything, but just in that one area, it breaks down whether the cooperation is formal or whether it's material, or formal or informal is material or immaterial. What I mean by that is, formal is a sort of cooperation with an evil that we intend that evil to result because of our act. So we can get into all kinds of examples, but that's one idea. And the idea is that we can't formally cooperate with evil from a moral perspective because we're intending the actual evil. But there's ways that we're forced to act that include evil, but we're not formally cooperating with them. And we have no choice but to act. So that's an example. For example, when Christ was ordered to pay the tax to Caesar, and he asked, they tried to put him in a trap, and should we pay tax to Caesar? And he grabbed the coin and he says, whose image is on the coin? It's Caesar's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. And we know that he actually paid the temple tax. That's actually in the scriptures as well. But hold on a second. We also know that the Roman Empire, especially at his time, wasn't exactly the bastion of all good and holy. And so we can presume that some of that tax money paid by Christ himself would have gone to some evil deeds, maybe even to his own crucifixion, which we know to have been the greatest of all evils, since it was locally imposed. But the question is whether that was formal cooperation or informal cooperation. And the answer is obviously informal, because he's not actually hoping and intending for that denarius or whatever the coin that he used was to go for these evil purposes. And yet there's a duty to pay to the state for very, very good purposes, a tax, roads and defense and so on and so forth. And so even though they're intertwined, there's a principle upon which we can gauge whether we are formally cooperating or not formally cooperating. And in the same way, there's material and immaterial. Is that cooperation with the evil going to result in, but for you giving this cooperation, in the evil itself or not? And so there's principles upon which material cooperation is allowed if it's not formal, or immaterial. It depends on how far, and so on and so forth. That's just one area that it behooves us to know. It's St. Thomas wrote extensively about it, and so did Pope John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor, one of his encyclicals. So that's just one little area, and it's a massive principle.
Yes.
So the question is, how is... I get what your question. I think I see where how do we go about discerning this, right? Well, one of the primary virtues that the moralists speak about is the virtue of prudence. Prudence is the application of right reason to action. In other words, it's having our acts correspond with the truth. And how do we do that? Well, if we don't have it ourselves, St. Thomas says the only way we're going to grow in prudence that we don't have is to borrow prudence. He calls it borrowed prudence, which is basically a form of another virtue called, two virtues, docility and counsel. To take counsel, and to take counsel from the wise. And so if we don't have it ourselves, then, well, we should learn it and grow in the virtue of knowledge and understanding as to what the proper thing is. And then if we don't have it, then we should go to people who do. Like I did when I read that book about the problem of pain from C.S. Lewis.
But see, how do you know who to trust? Who's the trusted counsel to go to?
So this is why I believe in a church that has been doing this for 2,000 years on a very consistent basis. One of the greatest miracles of the Catholic Church is the fact that 2,000 years of inerrant teaching, 2,000 years of formal teaching, it's never contradicted itself. It never once said, well, listen, God in his interior life is a Trinity. Well, no, he's a quadrinity. Or, Christ is 100% human and 100% divine. Oh, no, he's 50-50. It's never declared something formally and then contradicts itself, which is I think miraculous. At least it points to something that we need to raise an eyebrow to. I mean, the Constitution of the United States is 200 years has been amended itself 27 times. But in 2,000 years, the church hasn't amended itself once. So there's something to be said about that. So I would start there for those of you out there who are Catholic, even those who aren't. There's 2,000 years of teaching that many of the faith traditions actually lean upon and expand or try to expand upon, or at least grow from as a basis. Maybe go to those teachings because it's proven to be very, very wise, at least in helping build a moral framework upon which we have modern Western society. But that's, I guess, another discussion. But just as, there's the principles of cooperation with evil, I bring that up because, like I said, it inevitably is going to happen in the political spectrum because we're not voting on people that are perfected saints necessarily. But there's also other principles. There's principles of the positive law and principles of the natural law and how the positive law should correspond to the natural law and then how divine law comes into that. All these principles are principles that are ultimately necessary if we're going to know even how to vote. And so hopefully we can rely on ultimately the hierarchy, but on wise individuals who know these principles to set forth clear teachings so that we know how to follow them.
And what source would you recommend to Catholics and non-Catholics who are trying to get that ordered sense?
Well, you can't go wrong. I know it's impossible to just pick it up and slam through it, but the Summa Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas is amazing. Peter Kreeft is a wonderful philosopher out of Boston College. He has a book called The Summa. You would be, there's far worse places to start than that one.
Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Leo.
You're welcome.
That's
Thank you for having me.
All right, you guys. So you had it from Leo. Please check out his book, Going Deeper. If you want to think more about the logical steps, his book does a great job on it. And thank you. Thank you for joining our show.
You're very welcome.